In the previous session, we explored the basic components of the communication process. In this session, we'll concentrate on the role of the reader. And that will enable us in the next session to move to some important exponents of hermeneutical theory, in this case, Gadamer. For this session, we come to one of the revolutionary events in the history of hermeneutics and interpretation. And that is the discovery of the role of the reader. Now, this might sound surprising that there is a discovery of the reader, because in biblical texts there were always an awareness of the audience or the addressees. Many of the letters have specific audiences. It was sent to the Corinthians or the Galatians, or Theophilus was the intended receiver. But nonetheless, that was underplayed, the role of the receiver in the whole process. Now, we should have been aware, if we again learn from the parallels with biology, that the receiver is a crucial element in this whole process. The question is, what exactly is this role and what are the implications? For ages, as far as theology is concerned, the authority was by the sender. And that is understandable so, because these religious texts were seen or understood as texts emanating from God Himself, and therefore carries the authority of God, prophets speaking in the name of God, and therefore the dominance was on what was the intention of God, what is the meaning of the author of these texts, and that should be the determining factor. And for a long time in exegesis, but also in the history of dogma, it has been the focal point, the so-called authority of Scripture that it carries with itself. It is not only authoritative, but it has a divine origin, and therefore the sacred status of the Bible. So the whole way we looked at biblical texts have been determined in many ways by this conviction of the origin of this literature. But the truth of the matter is that wherever these texts were read by the first readers or by subsequent generations, they only came to life, they only had their meaning exposed when there was a reader, a receptor, who not only heard, but interpreted, proclaimed, and transmitted, safeguarded this message from generation to generation. And this is what forms the basis of the church tradition. Readers who approach this text from their own perspective and contemporary understanding, in whatever age it might be, and trying to deal and wrestle with the original message as far as they were able to determine. We should not lose sight of the fact that the text has its own integrity as a so-called auto-semantic structure. And this sort of resilience of the text and its ability to outlive, as we saw, its situation of origin, should be kept in mind. But we will return to this aspect in due course. Our focus in this session is on the contribution of the reader. Now, the acknowledgement of the role of the reader opens two important aspects when we are dealing with the interpretation of text. The first of these is the so-called contextuality of text production, and that is an appreciation that there was not only a situation of origin, but that there was a certain context with certain presuppositions, with certain understandings. And that really provides the basis of what is now called contextual theology, which is the flip side of the origin. That means that the reception is also within a specific time frame, specific social conditions that has an influence how that interpretation takes place. And the rise of contextual theology, liberation theology, feminist theology, all kinds of variations of contextual hermeneutics or theologies has its origin in this discovery. Now, this has huge implications for the interpretation of the Bible as a whole. It opened up new dimensions, as we will see, but this is directly the consequence of the discovery of the original contextuality. The original event of understanding was not timeless or contextless, but was within a very specific situation. Secondly, the emphasis on the role of the reader opened at another important dimension of communication. That is what Isa would call the wandering viewpoint of the reader. What he shows is that in the text, you don't have only the author that sends out the message. You have also the perspective of the reader, whether it is the reader that the author has in mind, or whether it is the actual reader that takes up the text. So there are different perspectives within the text, captured within the text. In many of the letters, as we've already indicated, the intended reader is identified as the Corinthians or the Galatians or Theophilus. But as we also saw, those were the first readers. And beyond that first readers, they became other readers. Hartman has a very interesting article that he calls reading other people's letters. And he says, look, he was brought up that it is not really good manners to read the letters of other people. But he says, this is what we're doing as theologians. We are reading letters that were really not addressed to us in the first place. Of course, we can say we are also part of this audience, but that is really a later set of readers that engage with the text. So all of these readers or the participants in this process, as is captured in the text, open the possibility to look at the reading process or the understanding process from different perspectives. And this is what they then called the wandering viewpoint of the reader. Isa says it is not possible to capture the full meaning of the text if you don't move around and you find all of these perspectives that make a contribution. So for Isa, there is a contribution to be made when we examine the intention of the author and the way that the author gives instructions to the reader. There is something to be gained when we look at the designated role of the receiver. But it is also indications or something to be gained from the different characters in the story, and then also obviously of the plot of the specific text. If we take the text of Mark, it is one of these puzzling ways how the gospel ends and who really is the intended receiver of the message. So until the reader moves around and try to bring the different horizons and perspectives together, it will be not possible to grasp the full potential and implications of this text. What we see here is a first anticipation of what Gadamer will call the two horizons. The horizon of the text and the horizon of the reader. And we will see how the reading process brings these two horizons together in what he calls the fusion of horizons. Finally, we must distinguish between the implied reader and the real reader. And this is perhaps a subtle difference, but an important one. In the text, there is a certain reader anticipated. If it is the text of Luke, the assumption is that the reader is somebody who can read Greek, somebody who understands the distinctions in the Jewish community between scribes and Pharisees, somebody who is familiar with the landscape of Palestine. These are all givens that are assumed that the intended reader or the implied reader will be able to process and to understand. But the intended reader, which is part of the textual structure, does not necessarily tally with the real reader, which is a person in flesh and blood and who reads from his or her own perspective. But the flip side is also true, that the real reader, focusing on the text and trying to discern the meaning, only has the residue or the signs of the implied author as is captured in the text. So the real reader also tries to reach the implied author and hopefully through that process end up with the real author. So you have this crisscross process where the real reader focuses on the implied author to get to the real author. And the real author have instructions for the implied reader that hopefully the real reader will follow. So what we have here is that the author's account produces an imaginary world evoked by the author himself. And that has to be related to the imaginary world or the interpretation of the text as produced by the real reader. And again, these are the basic elements of the two horizons that have to be fused. Now, what is amazing is that the circle of readers have dramatically increased. It's not only the first readers. It is also called the informed readers. That means the readers that have all the capabilities that was anticipated by the author. But then you have a critical reader who is aware of the process of communication. Maybe it might be we that are critical readers and aware of these two levels of interpretation. But you can have also an ordinary reader that is not informed with all these technicalities. Maybe it is a member of the congregation that reads spontaneously from his or her perspective. And then you can have the ideal reader, the person that complies with all the expectations what the reader process expects. So the circle of readers has increased. And it seems there are more and more options opening itself when dealing with a specific text. The last remark here is the awareness of the reader has also opened strategic positions to look at the text differently from not only its historical context, but the presuppositions that it carries with it. And what I mean here is readings so-called from the margin, or readings against the grain, or readings by readers that are actually excluded. The way that women read biblical texts are often from a different perspective and opening up sensitivity for what male readers would miss. And they discover in those texts that are clearly male-dominated, emerging from an original situation where the hierarchy of male dominance was the reality of the society in which these texts were produced. But nonetheless, discovering liberating possibilities within that text. And therefore, the ideal position for the reader is not right in the center of things. It often has advantages to be a descended reader. Let me give you one example. A lot of theological thinking and literature and production is from a Western European dominated perspective, and understandably so. People outside of that perspective and outside of that culture has an added advantage to see things that the normal reader conditioned by that culture does not see. And therefore, people reading from these unexpected places or perspective often have the advantage to discover dimensions in the text that was not visible for people who find themselves in the mainstream of interpretation.